Thank you very much, Kathy, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Jillian, the committee, and the Academy. In fact, it's the second time I've been involved in such an event organized under the auspices of the Academy. I see many familiar faces around the table, including my former boss and current WHO colleague. So if I go amiss, I'm sure others can correct me. What I would say is this presentation and the next are a natural fit, because what I'm going to talk about is how we benchmark regulatory systems. But of course, the end is to really strengthen regulatory systems, and Analia will be talking a bit about that. So to start off with some background to the WHO Regulatory System Strengthening Program, which my team is responsible for. It began in 1997 globally with the benchmarking and strengthening of vaccine programs. And in 2014, May 2014, the importance of strong regulatory systems was recognized in World Health Resolution 6720 on regulatory system strengthening for medical products, recognizing that regulatory authorities approving and overseeing the regulation of medical products play a vital role to the overall healthcare system. If you're effective, transparent, and efficient, it, of course, is a plus. On the other hand, if you're not, then it can be a great barrier, an impediment to access. The ultimate goal, of course, in all of this effort is to promote access to quality assured medical products, which is also SDG 3 target, access to safe, effective, quality, and affordable essential medicines and vaccines for all, but in fact we can read that all medical products. So talking about the global benchmarking tool, this came about, this terminology, in 2016. There were previous tools that we used within the WHO to assess regulatory systems. It provides an objective and well-tested methodology for benchmarking regulatory systems, establishing institutional development plans for addressing areas for improvement, and importantly, for monitoring progress. Importantly, since 2016, we've also been talking about maturity level of regulatory systems with the objective of bringing all regulatory authorities to a level commensurate with a stable, well-functioning system. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few moments. So this is a map of the world and sort of the view in 1997, where you can see we started with the assessment of a few countries. If we fast forward to 2015, you can see that we've covered the globe, essentially. And since then, many of the countries that are not in green are now. And in fact, this has gone from vaccines to medicines as well. So we've seen just about every type of regulatory system there is, from the largest, we benchmarked US FDA, to the smallest, and some of the challenges and common challenges that we see. I mentioned the resolution, and this is so important to providing the mandate and legitimacy for the work that we do, calls upon member states to invest in regulatory system strengthening, but it also calls on the WHO, importantly, the Director General, to undertake a number of activities on behalf of the member states, including the evaluation of the regulatory systems, applying WHO evaluation tools, generating evidence of performance, and, as I mentioned, helping formulate institutional development plans and providing assistance to bridge the gaps. This is a busy slide. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but it is the methodology that we approach or use to actually strengthen regulatory systems, from developing the benchmarking tools to the actual benchmarking, the institutional development plans that we help formulate with the countries, providing technical support, training, learning, etc., and then monitoring progress. And this is an iterative cycle here. Now, I've got a few slides because I have been asked to talk about the global benchmarking tool. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it is important to understand how we approach this. And this is the tool, but we also have a user guide that provides guidance on how to actually benchmark. Importantly, you can see the hierarchy of the tool. And I'm going to just walk through the various layers of this quickly. At the highest level, we assess or benchmark every regulatory system according to the overarching regulatory framework, which includes the enabling laws and statutes and regulations, which gives authority and power to the regulatory authority, which could be one or more institutions, often more than one institution. And then we look at a number of regulatory functions, such as product registration and marketing authorization, vigilance, regulatory inspection, etc. As you can see on the left-hand side, common functions here, but we have one non-common function which pertains to biologicals, including vaccines, and that is lot release. That would not be necessarily applicable to, for example, medicines. Then we actually organize the tool according to a number of cross-cutting themes or indicators, such as legal provisions, regulations, and guidelines, or quality and risk management systems, which exist at the overall level, but also at each regulatory function. So from the tool, which is also computerized, we can pull out data and findings, if we wanted to, on policy and strategic planning or on regulatory processes. So it allows us to do that and then to analyze according to specific categories. What we actually assess, though, is at the level of the sub-indicators, and we have 260 some odd sub-indicators and associated fact sheets that provides the assessors with guidance on what is it that you're looking at, why is this important, what evidence do we expect you to collect, and what are the references, what are the baselines, what are the standards that countries should be respecting as we look at that. Previously, we talked about functionality. Are you a functional regulatory authority? And around that, we had critical sub-indicators and non-critical sub-indicators. But we've really retired that concept and have, as I said, moved to maturity level. And in fact, if we go to the next slide, which is probably one of the most important slides, you can see that we really stratify regulatory systems according to 4 maturity levels. And this is based, in fact, on ISO 9004, where they have 5 levels. The 5th level is best in class, and we felt that this was not germane to public health. But you can see here from maturity level 1, essentially no formal systems. Some elements of a regulatory system exist, but you might not have an actual institution that is responsible for all of the activities to regulate medical products. The terminology at the top is from ISO. In white is what we've described in the world of regulation of medical products. The target here for us and under the resolution would be maturity level 3. So this would be a stable, well-functioning, and integrated regulatory system. And I say integrated because often you have different institutions and bodies and ministries in a country that are responsible for the regulatory system. And often they don't communicate, or they have not clear mandates and areas of responsibility, and this creates problems. Maturity level 4 is what we currently call a stringent regulatory authority. These are the most advanced regulators, so regulatory system operating at an advanced level of performance and continuous improvement. This isn't the target for the WHO for all of the countries. It's not a realistic objective, but we are looking at trying to get as many countries as possible at maturity level 3. And as we look at our estimation of where the world currently stands, this is the problem that we confront. The fact that of the 194 member states, almost half are at maturity level 1. You can't be lower than maturity level 1. If you do virtually nothing, you are still at maturity level 1. So you see 99 countries, 51% of the 194 member states are at maturity level 1, 23% at maturity level 2, and only 26% are where we think, where we want to get the countries to be. So this is a compelling reason that we need to continue and enhance our work. Now, last year, exactly last year at this time, we published for the first time ever the Global Benchmarking Tool Revision 5 for comment. We received over 1,100 comments from regulatory authorities, from procurement agencies, from donors, from NGOs, from industry, you name it, we received comments. And that is a reflection of the amount of interest there is in regulatory system strengthening and the tool. Virtually all of the comments were favorable, but many good suggestions. This week, we are publishing on our website the outcome of that and the tool, the revision 6, that we intend to use globally. So I would encourage you, in fact, to look at that. And in conjunction with that, something that is also important to this discussion and in promoting reliance is something that happened again in the last 2 years, and this is moving away from the term stringent regulatory authority, which was something that was initially developed at the request of Global Fund to look at quality assurance policies and standards for procurement and supply globally and regionally and in various countries. It was originally defined as the ICH group before the reform of ICH. So these are the members and observers of ICH. And it was developed, as I said, to promote reliance and guide procurement decisions. It is widely used. It is widely recognized. But there were concerns with the terminology stringent regulatory authority, because if you're not designated as stringent, what are you? You're not stringent. So there were connotations around that, and also a recognition that ICH is a harmonization initiative. It doesn't have the mandate or competence to assess the performance of regulatory systems, and it is dealing with pharmaceuticals, not medical devices, not vaccines, not biologics, but pharmaceuticals. And we also have now an expanding ICH with new membership, including on the management committee. So as a result of that, WHO proposed a replacement for the term and for the designation process. And these led to, and it was public consultation as well, led to a series of recommendations from the Expert Committee on Specifications for Pharmaceutical Products. And here they are: that the term SRA be replaced by WHO listed authority, or WLA, that the currently identified SRAs be regarded for a period as WHO listed, so in other words, to grandfather them in. The designation of additional new NRAs, National Regulatory Authorities, be based on WHO Global Benchmarking Tool and the completion of a confidence building process, and that the procedure for listing be developed through a public consultation process. Later this month, we will be publishing for public consultation a concept note around that. So the concept note will propose a definition for WLA. define proposed criteria and process for designating a regulatory authority as listed, as a WLA, and the process and timelines for finalizing the designation and listing process. Given the wide ramifications of this, we are going with this broader consultation process. We're looking for implementing this process in 2019 together with the introduction of the Global Benchmarking Tool revision, I should say, 6. Some of the considerations is it is a voluntary process. A country has to approach us to request this. For the first time ever for the WHO, not in the Americas region with PAHO, but at least globally, we will publish the outcomes of this. We constantly are asked, what maturity level, how strong is a particular regulatory authority? We have never disclosed that because that is confidential information unless the country so chooses. That will change with this. So just as we have a pre-qualification list for products, we will have a WLA list for regulatory authorities. The process, of course, must be transparent, practical, flexible, etc. We will list both maturity level 3 and 4 agencies and specify. We also have to contend with the existing SRAs that are grandfathered in, and the issue of equity and moving forward with renewal. How can we use, by looking at evidence that is available, that in fact they continue to be WLAs. We also felt, and actually Analia had made this comment during our preliminary discussions, that we can't disrupt the global supply of quality assured medicines, which relies on stringent regulatory authorities in large part, and by purchase by UN procurement agencies and countries themselves. And also, this designation is not intended to affect regional designations. That is significant here in the Americas, where we have NRAs of regional reference. But this, if you want to be globally recognized, we will be following the process at the end of this consultation. I'm not going to, in the interest of time, spend a lot of time on this slide, but just to say that we see many positive ramifications and implications from this, including promoting reliance between regulatory authorities, guiding, again, procurement decisions, and also expanding the base of regulatory authorities that can help expedite the pre-qualification program if they are, in fact, designated WLAs. And we're having discussions around this. And we also have to look at, beyond pre-qualification, the products that are not pre-qualified, but if you are maturity level 3 or 4 agency, what are the implications in terms of the products that are approved by these agencies? So, as I mentioned, maturity level 4 will equate with the current stringent regulatory authority, and it could be for a particular program, such as generic medicines program, or it could be for a regulatory function, such as inspection. And we will actually designate that or make it clear when we list the outcomes of this. As I mentioned, it would allow for a bridged procedure for pre-qualification depending on the scope of the designation. I'm ending just by saying that the global benchmarking tool is looking at systems, functions, but does not look at one very important element, and that is the human being. And this quote is actually taken from the North American aviation industry, saying the human being is a vital link in the chain of operations, but is also by nature the most flexible and variable. So in fact, how do we deal with this? So we are in parallel undertaking the development of a global competencies framework and curriculum that will help to standardize this. And we recognize that this is one of the greatest challenges facing regulatory systems. And the need is in relation not only to strengthening the regulatory system, but promoting joint activities, promoting harmonization and information and work sharing. We need to look at a common basis, internationally acceptable competencies for those that undertake inspections, that are responsible for clinical trial oversight, pharmacovigilance, etc. So this work is quite advanced and actually began with a work sanctioned by the US FDA. And it was, they worked with RAPS and IFPTI on the food side to develop a baseline and engage many experts globally. That work was then handed over to my team, and we have developed it extensively from that point. So we have defined a very robust, we think, a set of competencies. The next step would be piloting this in countries and regions, putting it for public consultation and amending that. But from that, then we have to look at a curriculum that would address these competencies, and then from that, look at which institutions globally and regionally can step in and help fill this in a sustainable manner, rather than workshop after workshop. What impact is it? Is it competency-based training? Most of the time, it is not. So this is the goal. Ensure a standardized training approach and systematic development of competent regulatory professionals in regulatory agencies, not only in low and middle income, but it's equally applicable in high income. And just to say that this is divided into mandatory, generic competencies, and occupation-related competencies. So under mandatory, for example, teamwork, communication. How do you communicate with your stakeholders? This is cross-cutting. And at the same time, we are also looking at career development and expertise. So the advanced beginner, competent, and then the expert. And in ending, to say this year, as I mentioned, we will be looking at a public consultation, piloting this in 2 to 3 countries of different maturity levels, also in regional settings within regional networks. And from that, we will be revising the competencies framework, and then looking at the actual curriculum that would go along with this, and start to look at potential institutions that whom we are already having discussions around in certain areas that could in part address these needs. So thank you for your attention.
Let me ask members of the committee, do you have a question for Dr. Ward? I see you ready to go, Jono.
That was great.
Use your microphone and introduce yourself so people on the webinar will know who you are.
Jono Quick, Senior Fellow at Management Sciences for Health and former Director of Essential Medicines at WHO. That was great, and I can say that having had almost nothing to do with that area, so as an outside person. But so a couple of questions. The key thing is turning the results of the benchmark into the institutional plan. So I'm wondering if you have any tracking system for the institutional development plans. And the other thing is whether some of these have been done over time, so you can see the development of agencies, and whether you have a sense of whether there's some common barriers that get in the way of moving from level 1 and 2 to level 3 and 4.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the questions, and absolutely. So we actually monitor the institutional development plan. So we identify some areas that need to be addressed, and the countries, as they start to address, we have a SharePoint where in fact they provide information on how they develop a guideline, how they're revising a regulation, how they're staffing up. And so this is an ongoing process. It's not one point in time, as you can imagine. And for some of the authorities, we've been working with them for 10 to 15 years to get where we are. But it's not the end of the process because there's always room for improvement. But common areas, common challenges, absolutely. And one of them would be, do they have the authority to do what they need to do, to take action, particularly post-market if something is happening? Do the various institutions communicate and understand their respective mandates well? Often they do not. Quality systems within regulatory authorities in great need of improvement. So we do, in fact, see that. But, you know, one of the things that we have to confront and be frank about it is governments have to invest. And if they don't invest, if they don't take it seriously, we can see that right away. You know, so one of the criteria for prioritizing what we do is that we see a commitment. And when we do, it makes all the difference. You know, so I think there's got to be support at the highest levels, and it has to be sustained. But yes, in fact, we do see many common challenges in regulatory systems.
Let's go clockwise this time. So Raymond, you're next up.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for your excellent presentation of the topic. I wanted to ask you one question. While discussing about the key issues in medicine's regulatory system, you indicated of the effective legislation, regulations, and guidelines. But I didn't hear you talking anything about the enabling policies. Because in most cases in developing countries, we have seen that overlap and duplication of functions are partly caused because of the absence of policies, which really identify stakeholders' role and demarcation of responsibility. I don't know whether this one is a key component also. Thank you.
Thank you, and it absolutely is. So we always look at, do you have a national pharmaceutical policy? And some countries do, but many don't. And you're absolutely correct that we need to look at the enabling policies and not just the legislation, which should, in fact, flow from that. Many examples come to mind. I won't name countries where, in fact, they were in the weeds, you know, about what they thought was important, when in fact we had to sort of bring them back and say, you have to start at this level. And sure, these things don't happen overnight, but you have to start it, you know, or that should be a priority for you. A strategic plan, an HR plan, enabling legislation, policies, as you suggest. So this is all part of it. And just getting back to the previous question as well, a lot of countries don't know what they don't know. So you'll get people who say, oh, we should be ISO certified 17025, you know, for either laboratories, inspection, etc., and they don't have pharmacovigilance. They don't have an overarching policy on pharmaceutical policy, and it's fragmented, you know. So this is another issue that if you could sort of back up and say, from the design stage, we need to have a discussion if you really want to move forward.
Good. Next question, Maria Elena.
Yes, thank you for a very enlightening presentation. I have a two-part question. So one is related to the maturity levels, and the second is more related to the training. So with the maturity levels, maybe could you give us an example of what kind of incentives would a given country make the decision to going from an ML1 into going into the 2 or even beyond, or the 3? What are the drivers and incentives that maybe they would be interested and to make it sustainable, right? And the second question, which is related to training, how much does the WHO and your programs eventually could be integrated within formal academic degree training rather than just professional advancement? Because I feel probably where do you really go study to be eventually a regulator, right? And if it's only done as an add-on rather than just a real full curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Very good questions. In terms of incentive, this is something that we need to be able to describe this in terms that a minister of health, a government, a head of agency can understand. It can't be too complex and too technical. So we're in the process of actually developing a short document that would address exactly the question that you raised. But I would say, from my perspective, if you're at maturity level 1, you're not protecting your public. And we know that medical products aren't like any other products. The consumer, the patient, can't judge quality. So we are supposed to be the regulators, the learned intermediaries that act on behalf of the public good. And if you're not doing that, then it's a disservice to the country and to your citizens. So the greatest incentive, in fact, would be to be at a level where you're doing that effectively, transparently, efficiently. Doesn't mean that you have to do everything yourself. We are not promoting that. In fact, the contrary. We are promoting the concept of reliance on other trusted institutions, such as the pre-qualification program or other NRAs, wherever possible. And if you have scant resources, that you look at what others can't do in your country, but is of high value to public health, such as pharmacovigilance, such as inspection of local manufacturers, such as supply chain and good distribution practices. So for me, the incentive would be that. It also has spin-off benefits when it relates to investment in the country, to innovation, to promoting access to, again, quality assured products. Because access alone isn't sufficient. You could be promoting access to poisons. It has to be quality assured. How do you do that? You have to be a competent regulatory authority, but it doesn't mean that you have to do everything yourself. And even with the high-income countries, US FDA, EU, MRA, GMP, we want to see more of this through networks and more reliance between regulatory authorities. In terms of training, we've been doing a lot of training, as you can imagine, over the years. And it's really unsustainable because you can benchmark, you can develop an institutional development plan. The heavy lift is addressing these gaps and these needs, and some of them are quite substantial. So our vision would be, in fact, to do what you've just suggested, to work increasingly with trusted institutions in a sustainable manner with definitive training and approaches, including case studies, not going back home. You can't apply it, you forget it. It's got to be mentoring. There's a whole methodology around this that is important. But the WHO shouldn't be doing this alone. We should be identifying what the training needs are and the priority areas, but we absolutely need to look increasingly at centers of excellence and institutions that can help address this according to competency-based training.
Mike, thanks for a very informative and also clear and precise presentation, and also commendable work, how far we've come on this journey. I have one very simple clarification question and a second question. The simple clarification question is, this is for medical products only, does not include food regulation. So what happens to countries where it's an integrated regulatory agency? Is the WLA designation for the agency or for just the drug regulatory division of the agency? So that's a clarification question. And the second is, you may have mentioned this, I may have missed. What is the status and timeline for those NRAs which have achieved level 3 or above, or essentially have become WLA, for UN agencies and the World Bank to allow manufacturers to participate in their procurement from manufacturers who are approved by WLA agencies. Has that process started, and where do we stand in it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your questions. On the first one, you're correct. It is for medicines and vaccines, and it could be one or the other. We now have a harmonized tool to assess both, but it is up to the country to decide whether we assess against vaccines or medicines or both. This year, we should have tools for measuring blood and blood products and medical devices. So I think at least the beta versions of this, and that they will need to be piloted. But it does not cover food. But the designation will be very clear. So when we post it, it covers the following. And we might say it doesn't cover, in certain instances, other things. One of the interesting issues that came up were export-only provisions, which are an issue globally, and so we're not going to tackle that in the benchmarking tool because of the implications, but we can make some comments about what the designation includes and does not include. Your second question, please, if you could just remind me, was?
For agencies which have become level 3 or level 4.
Yes. Okay. So this is looking forward. So we haven't actually put the WHO listed authority process in place yet. That is something that we have to do this year. And we certainly are in discussion with funding agencies, with procurement agencies. So through the IPC, the Interagency Pharmaceutical Committee, where USAID, UNICEF, Gavi, you name it, are around the table. They are all looking at this and saying, okay, this has tremendous implications for us. They have been supportive. They have many questions, which will come from the public consultation. And then we will see. But we feel that this is the only way to go. But your question remains to be seen and answered.
Okay, and then the last question is Veronica.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica Wirtz, Boston University. Thank you very much, Mike, for a very interesting and good presentation. So 2 questions. One is a question around the level of transparency, and I'm very inspired by what you said about the outcomes will be publicly available. I think that's a very laudable goal. But what would be the level of granularity of that? Would that be the result in terms of saying, okay, the assessment shows at level 1, or it's level 2, it's level 3, or does this go further into detail? And I like a lot, you alluded to the fact of the website that gives all the indicators, and you have these fact sheets and everything, which I think is a fantastic tool. Would it be possible, for instance, going into detail and saying which of the indicators have not improved over 3-year period, 5-year period, etc. So to have more granularity, and that I'm asking that specifically for this committee, because if we want to make recommendations, probably we want to be more specific and more granular in our recommendations. And then the second question is about your point on the document that you will give to make a case, a pitch for investment in these regulatory authorities. We had a discussion at the committee, which I think is very important, around the point of incentives. And you said, yeah, of course, it's for the public and for the public benefit. But we know that this case of, it's for the public benefit often falls short of really moving stakeholders. And I would be particularly interested in, have you discussed and are you aware of any economic analysis? In other words, making a business case of investing in regulatory authority. I think the committee would appreciate some guidance on it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, on the first question, I'm thinking that Analia can also address this as well, because we take our lead from what PAHO has done, so in the Americas, where, in fact, we have 8 NRAs of regional reference, and that is publicly known. And when you sign on the dotted line, you also agree that the outcome, yes, you are a level, whatever, level 4 in the case of NRAs of regional reference. But the question that you ask has been the subject of much debate. you can imagine that this is a highly sensitive issue, and that some countries, they own the information, right? It pertains to their system. Some might be more inclined to say, yes, it's okay, you can provide more information, some less. What we could consider, and this is what is existing here in the Americas, is that publicly, yes, you say maturity level and against the following. And you date it, right? But then the agencies that have committed to this, for those that commit, they can see more data on a secure regulatory platform between the agencies. And then the real granularity resides with the agency in the country. So we could consider a tiered approach to that, in fact, yes. And I'm sorry, your second question?
Economic analysis.
Oh, yes. We actually did a study a number of years ago with 3 countries around this. And in fact, going back, if it would be helpful to the committee, we can follow up on that. It predates me, but I know that we did look at this as part of a study for some of the reasons that you're suggesting, you know, the economic drivers. Just before this meeting, however, I was just a few blocks from here in another meeting saying, you know, we as an industry are not really prepared to invest in this region because of the regulatory situation, which is a disincentive to access and to innovation. And until we deal with the regulatory issues, harmonization, that in fact we have a major problem. You know, so if we look at the economic drivers, this is certainly, and different perspectives, this is one that has also been raised.
Thank you, Mike, very much. I've allowed this question and answer to go far beyond what we had allotted originally in the agenda, but the nature of the project that you've described is so central to our work that I thought the question and answer period merited that time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
And there will be opportunity, I'm sure, through the rest of the afternoon for more interaction with you. Thank you.